All right. Good morning. My name is Anne Marie Drofke. I am the Education Manager for the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association. On January 1st of 2020, the Cannabis Regulation Tax Act became law and permitted the use of personal and recreational cannabis for all individuals 21 years of age and older. The Act identifies and allows employers to adopt certain cannabis policies relating to use, consumption, storage, and impairment to further protect employee safety. We are joined today by Tim Teleke of In Out Labs. Tim will discuss drug testing for employers, things to consider when writing your company policy, and how this law affects other regulating bodies within your company, such as CDL drivers. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. Therefore, we ask that you remain on mute. Any questions can be sent using the chat box and will be presented to Tim at the end of the presentation. Tim, I'm going to transfer it over to you. Take it away.
Okay. Are we all set? Great. All right. Thank you very much. Some of you might remember me from my 18 years in the green industry. And my name's Tim Teleke. My company's In Out Labs. We've been around since 2012. And my company was Garden.
It looks like we are having a bit of
concepts for 18 years. I know the industry reasonably well and still have a lot of friends in the industry. About how drug testing risks employers face. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Things you need to make sure you have in your drug policies. Things specifically that address CDLs, because I know for a fact that many in the industry don't fully understand the DOT regulations. Certainly talking about marijuana, that's a big topic. We'll spend a lot of time on that. CBD, and then some Q&A at the end. When it comes to drug testing in general, and I'm going to go pretty quick because there's a lot of stuff. There are two different categories of employers that drug test. There are those that are regulated primarily by the Department of Transportation, and there's the non-regulated, which are employers that can drug test because
I'm sorry, so keep going and we'll address that attendee.
When we talk about the, okay, thank you, good. So under the Department of Transportation, there are a number of different agencies, 5 or 6 depending on how you count them. There's the FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carriers, but you've got the FAA, the FTA, FRA, PHMSA, which is Pipeline and Hazardous Materials, and they've got the Coast Guard, which is governed by the same rules, but it's also under the not HHS, but it's a defense, right? Military. So we primarily are concerned with the FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carriers. The random drug testing rates, which are required by the law, are different for each agency. FMCSA, which is what governs your CDLs, 50% of them by law have to be random drug tested per year and 10% for alcohol. They can be done, the randoms can be selected through a standalone pool. So a company that has a whole bunch of drivers, the special software selects who gets tested each year, each quarter usually, or a smaller company with a handful of drivers can go into a consortium with drivers from other companies, and that's how most smaller companies are tested. DOT testing is 20% of the industry, so 80% is companies that choose to test. So if you are an employer that has CDLs, this is how you decide if you're required to drug test. Okay, if the vehicles they drive, we're talking about the landscape industry, it's primarily the first category. So if the vehicle is rated for 26,001 pounds or more, that is either with a trailer or without a trailer, you're required to be in a DOT regulated drug testing program. The other two here, unless you're driving hazmat trucks, probably don't apply to the industry. Kind companies that choose to test, or the reason that we test is primarily for safety. One of the 6 on-the-job fatalities is caused by drugs or alcohol. 80% of those injured in a work-related accident are not usually the drug-using employee. It's the guy who gets hit in the head with a skid steer. It's innocent coworkers that are injured. And we know how expensive workers' comp claims are. Speaking of workers' comp,
I apologize, Tim. If I may interrupt 1 minute, we do have an attendee who's joining us by phone. I don't know who it is, but please mute yourself before I dismiss you. Thank you.
Are we okay?
Yes.
Keep going.
Yes,
right.
now you can keep going. Thank you.
All right. Speaking of workers' comp, Illinois has on its books something called an intoxication defense. So basically what happens is if an employee who was injured in an accident is found to have drugs in the system or blood alcohol level of 0.08 or higher, the burden of proof shifts to the employer to prove that the substance did not cause the accident. This is why it's really important to include a post-accident drug and alcohol test because you may be able to successfully defend a workers' comp claim if there are drugs and alcohol in the system of the employee involved with the accident. Different industries have different substance issues. Construction is the 2nd highest. And if you look at this list here, you've got accommodation and food services, that's, hotels and restaurants, probably not a lot of safety issues there. Might be some cultural issues, but construction is pretty high on the list. And this is, when you talk about 14% of the industry having a substance issue, that's a pretty big number. And then even if you're not required to, employers test because they care, whether they, just basically an employee health issue. So addiction is a real problem, and sometimes a drug test is the best way to find it. Substance users are really good at hiding their problems. In the big picture of the cost to society, illicit drug use falls just under heart disease and ahead of diabetes, smoking, and obesity when it comes to the cost to society. Even if you don't really see it firsthand, it's one of those things that when I got into this industry, it was really eye-opening. I was really shocked because, drug use is not part of my daily interaction with people. I just was really naive about how bad it can be. And I've learned an awful lot. And it's just something to be aware of, that in the big picture, it's a big deal. Opiates, basically this is from the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Basically what's happening is, what has happened for years is doctors have been handing out, opiates, things like your Vicodin and OxyContin and things like that, hanging out like M&Ms, and people have been addicted. And what happens a lot of times, they get embarrassed and they're afraid to ask for help. Some of them will switch to heroin just because it's a similar high and it's half the price of black market opioids. So this is, you see it on the news every night, and it's real. So when it comes to the whole industry that is drug testing, there are 4 important players to understand. There is the consortium or third-party administrator. This is who the employer interacts with. That would be someone like we're a third-party administrator, but there are lots of others out there. And the TPA is sort of the ringleader of the whole process. So the other parts are the collection sites. You can't have somebody just mail in a specimen. You need to make sure it comes from the individual being tested. So IDs are checked, and a certain amount of due diligence is done by the collector to deter cheating. There's a chain of custody created at time of collection where The donor's ID is checked. Specimens are sealed with tamper evident seals. Everything is barcoded, and basically you're ensuring that that specimen came from that individual, so that when it gets to the lab, they can verify that it was not tampered with or substituted or anything like that. So the collection site is the beginning of the process. The sample goes to the lab analyzes it, and if they find it is positive on the first test, a screening test, then they test it again. They do a confirmation test, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And if it's positive, even if it's negative for us, it goes to the medical review officer. Now, let's say you have a positive test for amphetamines. So the MRO takes a look at this result and sees amphetamines and might see that it's, for example, Adderall. Well, Adderall can be prescribed or it can be abused. So how do you know? So the MRO will contact the donor and say, listen, I've got a positive here on your drug test for Adderall. Can you explain it? And the donor might say, well, I actually have a prescription for it for ADD. MRO will ask them to produce it. They'll take a picture of it, send it to the MRO. The MRO will verify the prescription with the pharmacy or the prescribing physician. And if the MRO determines that it's a valid prescription, then the result is released as a negative result. If they find out that somebody is, doesn't have a prescription, then it's a positive result for abuse. So this is important to understand this process when we talk about marijuana. So we'll get to that in a minute. So that's how the process works. It protects the privacy of the donor. The whole process has integrity. It protects the employer from learning about a health condition of an employee, because sometimes you don't need to know those things. You don't want to. So that's how that works. So here's kind of the flow chart, the way it works. When I mentioned the second test the lab does, the screening test is very quick. If something's negative, they release the result right away. And the result will usually come out, from us, we usually get them the next day if it goes to the lab. If it's non-negative, then they do what's called a confirmation test using a technology, usually something called GCMS, which is, it's a more, I'm not going to get into technical, but anyway, it's a more specific test. And they'll determine that the first test might say amphetamine, and the second one will tell you it's Adderall, and they just kind of verify, because the screening tests are not perfect, but they're quick. Negatives you can believe, positives you have to check. So that's how that works. So let's say the test is positive for marijuana, okay? And let's say your donor says they have a medical marijuana card. So what does the MRO do? Well, a lot of employers ask this question, and basically what happens is the MRO will always report a marijuana test as positive. There's no way for them to really verify anybody's medical marijuana status because it's not legally prescribable. Every state has different rules about marijuana. There's state issued cards. Some of it's really the Wild West. And so the MRO will always report it as a positive. Also, under the federal regulations for CDL drivers, anything under the Department of Transportation, marijuana is 100% forbidden, Schedule I drug, so it's always going to be a positive. So here's the DOT's official notice when it comes to medical marijuana. They basically say nope. And then here's the one on recreational marijuana. And again, they say no. So most non-DOT testing programs will follow the DOT rules and regulations. And we're going to go into a little bit about the Illinois law in a little bit. So drug tests can be performed a number of different ways. There's a rapid test. Most of those are urine. Some are oral fluid or saliva, which if anybody wants to know about those, let me know. They're not that great, the rapid ones. Or they go to the lab, which is the way that it's done in most cases. You can use urine specimens. They are generally the most cost-effective, easily available, and the detection windows, which we'll talk about shortly, are reasonable for recent use for the most part, except for marijuana. Hair testing is it's a lifestyle test. You can get as much as 90 days history from a hair test. It's a really good pre-employment test. It is a cocaine magnet. We get a lot of cocaine positives in hair tests simply because it doesn't stick around in urine very long, and hair, it detects a lot of it. Oral fluid is a growing testing methodology, recently approved by the DOT, although it hasn't been rolled out yet. Oral fluid is lab-based oral fluid is really good for recent use, especially when it comes to marijuana. So we'll talk about that shortly. So what drugs do you test for? Well, if you're testing CDL drivers, the federal government tells you exactly what you have to test for. It's a federal panel done on a special test form. All the ones in the green are in the federal panel: marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines. Under amphetamines, they're also including ecstasy or MDMA, and also crystal meth, PCP, and then standard opiates, which would be codeine, morphine, and heroin. Like Tylenol 3 will pop on that one. We get prescription Adderall, ADD drugs. Those are really the only prescriptions that you would see commonly in those 5 drugs. And then in 2018, they also added the ones in red, the oxys and the hydros, and these are the commonly abused opioids that you see on the news all the time. So those are in there too. We're getting a fair number of safety concerns. So basically what that means is, let's say a driver has a positive test for, he's taking Norco for back pain, all right? He gets a positive result, and he has a prescription. So the MRO will look at this, validate it, and say, well, listen, he's allowed to take it as a prescription, but I have some serious concerns about this guy operating a commercial motor vehicle. So that result will be released as a negative result with a safety concern. So they basically throw it back at the employer to decide what they're going to do with it. So other drugs are benzos. We do get some positives for that. That's like Xanax, barbiturates, methaqualone you don't see anymore, or propoxyphene, but they are tested for. And the other drugs, really of these, a 10-panel drug test is going to include all the green ones, and let's see, benzos, barbiturates, methaqualone, propoxyphene. That's like a 9-panel. It's the terminology gets a little cloudy because sometimes like methamphetamine will be separate from amphetamine. So that's kind of the way the panels work. But employers who are not regulated by the DOT can choose what they test for. Detection times, too small to read, but in general, most of your urine tests are going to go back, 1 to 4 days, except for regular users of marijuana can test positive 30 days after the last use, sometimes longer, but one-time use is just a matter of days. So if somebody says, hey, I used it once over the weekend, or 2 weeks ago I used it once, and they're positive now, not likely that's true. When it comes to oral fluid, one reason this is really becoming popular in non-DOT testing is that marijuana is about 24 to 30 hours of history. So if you're going to test somebody for suspicion or for post-accident, it is going to be very recent use. So I think you could definitely make an argument that they were impaired at the time of an accident. And then hair will go back 90 days. So reasons companies drug test, pre-employment is the most common. Of course, if you know it's coming, you can study for that test. Post-accident is a great idea, even if you're doing nothing else. Reasonable suspicion, same with that. Return to duty. This these are all required reasons to test for under DOT, so most companies will incorporate them as well. But return to duty is, let's say somebody fails a drug or alcohol test, they go for treatment, and then they need a negative test to get back to work. That's what that is. Under the Department of Transportation regulations, if a CDL fails a test, that return to duty test is directly observed, meaning a same-sex observer goes in the bathroom with them to make sure they didn't smuggle something in. Follow-up testing is basically a program after your return to duty. It can last as long as 5 years of unannounced, directly observed tests for a CDL driver. Non-regulated companies will also have follow-up programs, usually, and then random testing is your biggest deterrent. All becomes, I mean, there are 5 big parts of a drug-free workplace program. The key to it really is having a written policy, and that's where you basically define the rules and the consequences. And it's a good idea to address marijuana separately from other drugs, and it's also a good idea to determine what your company policy is on medical versus recreational marijuana. Supervisor training, that's training your supervisors to recognize when somebody is impaired and what they're supposed to do. These are trainings that I know we offer them, online and live, and you can find them elsewhere as well. It's required under DOT, but it's become something a lot of employers are looking for with the marijuana rules, because there's a higher likelihood that somebody may show up at work impaired. Employee education, employee assistance, and drug testing. These are all the 5 parts of a drug-free workplace program. So some companies will test only safety-sensitive people, employees, and if you're a DOT regulated company or CDLs, that's defined by regulation. If you are not regulated and you want to test your people in the field versus the people in the office, then you can, write your job descriptions so that certain people in certain categories are part of a testing program. This phrase here I think is really good. It's from an employment attorney who's active in our industry. Employees who discharge duties fraught with risks of injury to others that even a momentary lapse of concentration can have disastrous consequences. I mean, that could be someone working, who works on spreadsheets all day too. But if they're crossing guards, things like that. So these are examples of positions that could be safety sensitive. All right. So this is some numbers just from Colorado, because they've had the legal marijuana the longest. So since recreational marijuana was legalized, traffic deaths in which drivers tested positive for marijuana increased 109%, while all Colorado traffic deaths increased 31%. Traffic deaths involving drivers who tested positive for marijuana more than doubled. And one of the reasons, there's no roadside test for marijuana, so deaths is really an easier number to measure because they can do a tox screen after somebody dies, and so that's why you often see the deaths as the statistic. Pretty important statistic. So drugs other than alcohol, this is from the CDC, are involved in 16% of motor vehicle crashes. You can see these numbers here. I'm not going to go over too many statistics, but the point is marijuana usage has become more common, and there are more driving accidents and fatalities as a result. And again here, more of this too. Employees who tested positive for marijuana, even when they're not high, I mean, we've all known stoners who are, let's say, less motivated, and maybe their minds are less clear than they ought to be. A lot of knuckleheads out there. Just a couple headlines. This was intoxicated driver. I think this guy was on crack. I can't see my notes on the slides right now. But I mean, look at those crazy eyes. I mean, this he doesn't look right, does he? Another guy. These were not marijuana drug. That's it on my slides. I'd be able to tell you, but I can't see the the notes there, but they're all over the news. I'd look for them so you see them. Here we go. 16% of American employees admitted to being high at work. That's a pretty high number, I think. Less than 10% in 2014, so 60% increase. So this is from 2019. It's a big number. Here's something to think about too when you're talking about medical marijuana. A lot of people who are using medical marijuana, they're not smoking it, so you really wouldn't smell anything. And maybe their treatment or whatever their doctor or whatever recommends says take 2 gummies every 4 hours. Well, if they're doing that, they're probably taking it during the workday. These are important things to understand and be aware that, you know, you have to be on the lookout for people who are high at work. This is a survey that comes out every year. This is basically 1 in 10 American workers have used illicit drugs in the last 30 days. 1 in 10 is a pretty big number. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, that's a government study. They're under the HHS, I believe. Legalized marijuana. As of this month, there are only 8 states where marijuana is fully illegal. On the map here, you've got the darkest ones are where recreational is approved, and the others are a mix of medical and decriminalized marijuana, which I'll talk about in just a second. Marijuana, cannabis, you can call it cannabis if you want, it doesn't really change what it is. The active ingredient that makes you high is called tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. That's what we're measuring at a drug test. Just basic effects, makes people feel happy, giggly, hungry, sometimes paranoid, loss of motivation. Heavy users are sometimes they build a tolerance, but they will often not be completely sharp even when they're not high. I love this incongruous perception of humor is a good way to recognize it. This is a slide from our supervisor training program. So what you might see as supervisor, I mean, this is a pretty good description of marijuana versus alcohol. When you're drunk, you run red lights, and when you're stoned, you stop at the green lights, and that's kind of the way the brain is affected. Decriminalization. So you hear talk about decriminalization and legalization, and decriminalization just simply removes or reduces criminal penalties for possession with the intent of freeing up the court systems and prison space. And then you've got legalization. That means it can be sold legally and usually taxed. So that's an important distinction to make when discussing legalization. I gave a presentation to the Illinois State Bar Association with a couple of attorneys, and one of the attorneys printed out the recreational marijuana law. This is what it looks like. It's a lot of pages. It has a lot of stuff in it, but there are some very specific things in it that affect employers. And this is important to pay attention to because the detail is clear as mud. So when it came out, and I'm going to read all of this to you because all right. So nothing in this act shall prohibit an employer from adopting zero or drug workplace policies or employment policies concerning drug testing, smoking, consumption, storage, or use of cannabis in the workplace or while on call, provided that the policy is applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Nothing in this act shall require an employer to permit an employee to be under the influence of or use cannabis in the employer's workplace or while performing the employee's job duties or while on call. Nothing in this act shall limit or prevent an employer from disciplining an employee or terminating employment if an employee for violating the employment policies. This actually sounds pretty good. It sounds really good for employers. Okay, great. It's legal, but nothing's changed. The problem is when they approved this law, they also altered what's called the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act. The Privacy Act is basically the law that protects off-duty legal behavior. So if somebody wants to have a beer at night, they can have a beer at night. If they want to smoke, they can do that. So anything that's legal off-duty, you can do. An employer can't hold you accountable. Like an employer can't test you for smoking and hold you accountable. So what happens, what in other states that have laws like this is they employers would rely on federal law to determine what's legal and not. But the Illinois law says specifically, it shall be unlawful for an employer to refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise disadvantage any individual with respect to compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because the individual uses lawful products off premises and the employer during non-working and non-call hours. As used in this section, lawful products means products that are legal under state law. So basically, off-duty marijuana use is allowed. So a positive pre-employment or random drug test for marijuana in Illinois merely confirms off-duty legal behavior. When we got into November, December last year, employers who are paying attention are just totally freaking out because they don't like this, especially if they've got employees that are working in manufacturing, or they're driving company vehicles, or they're operating skid steers, or driving non-DOT vehicles. So in December, after a lot of squeaking from employers, they amended the act. So now it says, nothing is act shall be construed to create or imply a cause of action for any person against an employer for actions taken pursuant to an employer's reasonable workplace drug policy, including but not limited to subjecting an employee or applicant to reasonable drug and alcohol testing, reasonable and non-discriminatory random drug testing, and discipline, termination of employee, or withdrawal of job offer due to a failure of a drug test. This is good news for employers. They didn't change this though, but most employment attorneys I talk to feel comfortable telling their clients that it's okay to test for marijuana. And I would argue that if you, especially if they have safety sensitive employees, I think you're on solid ground if you want to continue testing for marijuana. But it's still, it's not ideal, but you're okay. But that's what the law says. And then part of the original, the cannabis law also says, this is for your suspicion thing, situation, an employer may consider an employee to be impaired or under the influence of cannabis if the employer has a good faith belief that an employee manifests specific articulable symptoms while working that decrease or lessen the employee's performance of the duties or tasks of the employee's job position. Okay, so if an employee seems to be impaired, their eyes look funny, they're slurring, you're pretty sure that they're impaired. This, to me, I'm reading this saying you have to assume that they're high on marijuana without testing, which just seems weird to me, because what if they're on an opiate? What if they have some other health condition going on? Maybe there's something going on, but the law says you can just do it based on, what you see. So here's something that we see a lot of. We were seeing it before, but we're seeing more now, is people smuggle urine into a drug test. My buddy Chuck Marting out in Colorado, they've been doing this for years. This is one day's take. Each one of these, there's 1, 2, 8, 9. Those are 9 cheating devices they took from donors in their clinic in one day. So what's in there is a vial with urine, usually a heat pack and a rubber band, and there's a temperature strip on the vial. Now, even with these things, they caught people, and they're either because you can recognize synthetic urine, which is just goofy that you can even buy it, but you can recognize it. You learn to do that, and often the temperature isn't right, regardless of what they have in there. There's a temperature strip on a urine collection cup that lets the collector know whether it is within the normal range for, urine that just came out of a human being. So we see all these kits here. So where do you get them? Where do people get these things? Well, one place is Amazon. If you go, I was in there, I Googled fake urine or synthetic urine, and this thing popped up. So they've got the search criteria, set for the right people. The people they're trying to, the keywords, what I'm saying? But they call this a hidden pocket leg strap stash. So basically, it's not marketed as a cheating device, but it is. You can also find synthetic urine. It's a novelty item. So it's people who want to cheat, they would rather go to all that trouble than actually quit using drugs. So CBD in the news, has been for a long time. It's, again, the Wild West. In marijuana, there are two of many different elements that we talk about. One is THC, which is the psychoactive element, which makes you high. And then CBD is generally not considered to be psychoactive. Some people disagree, but CBD is primarily what you would get in the medical part of it. There are probably some benefits that come from it. But the thing is, they're selling CBD stuff, every counter shop, every cash register in the country. And there are many, many stories of truck drivers who were failing drug tests for marijuana who were taking CBD products. And, a lot of these drivers, over-the-road drivers, they spend their days in the truck. They don't necessarily have the healthiest lifestyle. They've got back pain. They're looking for ways to treat their discomfort, maybe sleep issues. And some of them are trying CBD, and they're failing tests for marijuana, and they're losing their jobs. It's not great. Again, if you are subject to testing that includes marijuana, say don't take CBD. It's just not because you are responsible for what you put in your body, even if you don't know what it is. So as much as 70% of these things are mislabeled. All right, and you see it in the headline. All kinds of warnings out there. It's just, again, Wild West. All right, so what's the big deal with marijuana? It's only an herb. It's natural. I wouldn't eat a yew either. They're natural, right? So it's not the same weed that was around when I was a kid. So THC is the psychoactive element. Before 1980, it was kind of 1 to 3%. In the 80s, it went to 4%, so more or less doubled in 95. 2007, 7%. 2019, 35% or more is not unheard of. And you get to the extracts, they can be as high as 90%. Today's marijuana is stronger, it impairs more and for longer periods, and it stays in the body longer. And if you want to understand what these are, if you go to the websites for both medical and recreational marijuana dispensaries, they tell you what's in each one. I mean, they'll say this is a certain type of marijuana. It's such a percent of CBD or THC, and it's not the same stuff. And so some people say, well, I don't care what they do over the weekend, as long as they're not high at work. Well, okay, makes sense to a certain degree if it didn't affect them at work. So 1985, Stanford did a study with airline pilots. These are private airline pilots. This was in the American Journal of Psychiatry. They took 10 experienced marijuana users. These are not, I said, not people flying, commercial airlines. Put them on flight simulators. They gave them some marijuana, and 24 hours afterward, they had trouble landing the planes. Despite the deficits, these pilots reported no awareness of impaired performance. The if you need the link to the article, it's there. I can send it to you if you want it, but it's just, this is 1985 marijuana. So let's call it 3% maybe, you know. It's a different world now. So another experiment, University of Iowa. This is only a few years ago. That says 2015. So they took, it was marijuana and alcohol combined, and quite often they are combined. You know, people who are using it recreational, they're usually drinking and using marijuana. Many are. So even 3 weeks later, they were having some tasks were not as good as they should be. So I'm sure they're cognitive tasks as well as physical coordination. So 3 weeks seems like a long time to me, but you know, let's call it 24 hours. That's important to know. And that's why I think this oral fluid testing for suspicion and post accident is a good one, because you know, it's 24 hours, 30 hours. You can make a case that they're still impaired if they used it yesterday. 2018, and I'm sure this is still the case, in Colorado, there were more marijuana dispensaries than Starbucks, McDonald's, and Subway combined. I published this in an article, and someone challenged me, and I sent him the numbers, and then he went silent. This is true. Is this going to happen in Illinois? You know, I don't know, but one would think that it might. So they say they don't market it to children yet. If you Google around, you can find some Pot Tarts and Keef Cats and all kinds of stuff like this. These may be black market. I don't know, but again, being marketed to children is not a good thing. These were taken from the DEA website. Marijuana use disorder. Basically, it can be habit forming for many people. There are a lot of articles out there talking about cannabis use disorder, saying a strong desire to take the drug, difficulties controlling its use, persisting in its use despite harmful consequences, higher priority given to drug use than other activities and obligations, increased tolerance, and sometimes a physical withdrawal state. They don't call it addiction, but it is habit forming. And so when you talk about drugs in the workplace, you know, half of all positive drug tests are marijuana. Marijuana is definitely an important part of it, but you know, the rest are other things. So, you know, we have one client who took marijuana out of the test panel about 2 years ago. It's an auto dealership, and you know, they have a limited candidate pool. You know, they have a certain type of people that are going to be porters and salespeople and this and that. They felt they were disqualifying capable people by including marijuana in the test panel. So we took marijuana out and we added some other drugs, and we've had a spike in cocaine positives, we had a unprescribed opiates, and we had a benzos, Xanax last fall. But I would say we have just as many positives with them. It's just their other drugs. So, and we're doing hair there too. So drugs, marijuana, whatever you want to call it, substance abuse. It's about safety and liability and company culture. And I think you can sense my anti-drug bias. And so I usually mention that at the beginning, but I guess I don't have to now. So that's what I have in the presentation. And I don't know if we have any questions to deal with, but we got, looks like about 15 minutes.
Wonderful, Tim. Thank you for that very informative presentation on the new regulations. We do have a few questions in our chat box that came in. The first one is in regard to the regulations surrounding cannabis and marijuana. Do the DOT regulations apply only to those drivers of vehicles over 26,000 pounds?
Okay. Yes. So here's the thing. Yes, any CDL who is driving a vehicle that 26,000 pounds, who has, it's usually a class A or B and drives that vehicle, is subject to the drug testing rules and regulations. If they are subject to the drug testing requirements, then marijuana is necessarily part of that. So if they are in that category of driving a vehicle that's 10,001 up to 26,000 where they require a medical card, they are not required to be in a DOT drug testing program. But they do have the medical card. If that, sometimes that's one of the questions too. I hope that answers it.
Thank you. Yes. And do you know where our attendees might be able to find sample company policies?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because they have to be customized. You know, you can Google to find them. I have a guy that writes them for me, so they're proprietary. I can't give them out. Mm-hmm. But there are a number out there. And you know what? And if you're going to find one, there are 13 points that a DOT policy has to touch. I'm happy to share that with people. So if you find something online, you want to make sure it addresses all of them. The most recent requirements are for the FMCSA clearinghouse, which I didn't talk about because it wasn't part of the presentation, but there's a new requirement for employers to comply with this new federal database of CDL drug violations. So the FAA has a sample policy there you could start with, and it's going to have, you know, most of the stuff covered there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from attendees that you'd like to submit to the chat box? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for logging on today and joining us for this presentation. Tim, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our attendees. If I have anyone who has any questions beyond this, then I will connect them with you via email.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Great. All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.